Hello, beautiful people. Pittsburgh Flip here for installment 3 of Diamond in the Window. This will be chapters 5 and 6 probably. Just doing a little bit of maintenance here. So I can see comments better. Okay, that's muted. Jane Langton, the first in the series, the Hall Family Chronicle series. We've got 4 chapters read. When we last left the kids, they were attacked by a jack-in-the-box, one that looked suspiciously like the evil parts of Prince Krishna. So, the next chapter is called The Search Begins. And here you can see Edward and Eleanor going up into the attic as it's come down. I'm going to wait just until 7 on the dot here. Hope everyone's doing okay. See, we have 1 viewer. 2 if you count me. I'm sort of viewing it and not viewing it. Okay. The search begins. It was a glorious morning. Eleanor leaned on the kitchen windowsill. She saw Mr. LaRue coming along the street, a trash barrel wallowing in front of him. Mr. LaRue was a carpenter and a handyman. The cool morning breeze, remarkable for the first day of June, was stirring the stately branches of Concord's 50 elms. Along Walden Street, the elms stood like tall vases in which someone had arranged long, leafy boughs. Eleanor felt rhapsodic. "Oh, beautiful elm trees," she said. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies. Oh, beautiful Mr. LaRue. Oh, beautiful whiskers of Mr. LaRue." The rosy morning light was shining on Mr. LaRue's good-humored old face and lighting up his resplendent handlebar mustache. He walked bow-legged and turned up the path that led to the barn, trundling his empty barrel. Uncle Freddy was already out. He was supposed to be weeding the vegetable patch, but when he saw Mr. LaRue coming, he started to frisk about. Mr. LaRue was used to Uncle Freddy. He stopped politely and lifted his hat. Then he turned his barrel upside down and sat on it. Eleanor ran out of doors and leaned her elbow on the silver gazing globe. "Tell me, Mr. LaRue," said Uncle Freddy, "what is written on the wind?" He cocked his head up and put his hand behind his ear, as though he were listening to the breeze. Mr. LaRue listened too, then hunched his shoulders. He didn't know. "Henry knows," said Uncle Freddy, "and so does Waldo." He jumped up on a tree stump and pointed his finger fiercely at Mr. LaRue. "Oh, mortal," he said, "thy ears are stones." Mr. LaRue looked worried and pulled at his big ears. They felt the same as ever, and he looked relieved. But Uncle Freddy still glared at him accusingly. "Oh, Mr. LaRue, call not nature dumb," recited Uncle Freddy. The trees and stones are audible to me. The wind that rustles down the well-known forest road, it hath a sound more eloquent than speech. Uncle Freddy jumped suddenly off the stump and made a lunge at the vegetable garden. He pulled lustily at a carrot top, and when it came up too suddenly, he rolled over backwards. Mr. LaRue set him gently back on his feet. Uncle Freddy was waving the muddy carrot in front of his eyes. It was a funny one, with two orange legs, like a man. "Brother!" cried Uncle Freddy. "Kinsman!" He was talking to the carrot. Eleanor giggled. Then he introduced the carrot to Mr. LaRue, who tipped his hat again and shuffled politely. "Immense unity!" groaned Uncle Freddy. Then he put his arm around Mr. LaRue and dangled the carrot in front of him, discussing it as if he were telling Mr. LaRue about their new mutual friend. "We are all made of one hidden stuff, Mr. LaRue. What is a tree but a rooted man? The elm tree thinks the same as me. So does my friend and brother here." Uncle Freddy took a huge muddy bite out of the carrot, then stuck what was left in his frayed lapel and smiled triumphantly. Mr. LaRue picked up his ash can and rolled it noisily away. He enjoyed listening to Uncle Freddy. It gave him a kind of mysterious good feeling, like church, only out of doors, in the sunlight. Eleanor ran to look for Eddie. Today they were determined to find at least one or two of the hidden jewels, even if it was just one or two pearls or a small ruby. She found him at work in the tower room. He was copying the mystic verses into his notebook, squinting at them and writing carefully, with his tongue between his teeth. He finished, and together they pored over what he had written. Then they spent the rest of the day searching for the clues. First, they cudgeled their brains over the harp that plays angelic chords. Eleanor could see it clearly in her mind. It would be a great gold-carved one with 1,000 strings. "They're very valuable, I know that," she said. But they couldn't think of where to look. For a while they wandered vaguely around the attic, but there weren't any boxes or trunks there nearly big enough to contain such a gigantic musical instrument. So they gave up on that for the moment and looked further down the list of treasures. Eleanor's attention fastened on the doll. Fit for a princess. How lovely it would be. Surely it would have golden hair and beautiful silken dresses. Perhaps it would look like a princess itself. She went off on an expedition of her own, groping through Aunt Lily's trunks, making a mess of the linens and the winter clothing. But she came away empty-handed, smelling faintly of mothballs. Edward, too, had been unsuccessful. He had been unable to find the mirror that hid a treasure. Starting with the mirror in the tower room, he had pushed up and down and sideways on moldings in search of secret hiding places. He had shoved big mirror-topped dressers away from the walls to look behind them, and he had stood on his head in front of them to look at himself upside down. Short of prying the wooden backs off them to see if $1,000 bills were hidden under the silvered glass, he didn't know anything else to do. Some of the verses were so puzzling that they didn't know where to begin. How could they learn to fly in order to bring down the diamonds in the sky? The treasure rounded by the sea lay somewhere, deep and dark. Where was that? And who and where was the Bride of Snow? Then Eleanor had a bright idea about the last verse. "Eye of bird, eye of fowl hides the treasure chest." What about Percival? He was a bird, and he was a fowl. She went straight to the peacock on the stair landing and looked carefully at his eyes. They were small, black, hard beads. Maybe one was a button, and if you pressed it, the peacock would open his mouth, and jewels would pour out. She tried it. Nothing happened. She tried pressing, twisting, and squeezing both eyes at once. Then she got a knitting needle and gouged the eyes out altogether. A apologizing under her breath to Percival all the while. They came out easily enough. Underneath each of them was just a hollow socket into which it had fitted, a socket lined with dried glue. Eleanor pushed her finger hard on the insides of the sockets. Nothing happened. Then she tipped Percival over and sat down on the steps with his head in her lap. Carefully and ruthlessly, she cut the stitches along the top of his head with her sewing scissors and pulled his poor moth-eaten skin back. The inside of his head was just a wooden knob covered with cotton padding. Eleanor took the padded knob out, shook it, squeezed it, and then hurriedly stuffed it back in and sewed up Percival's head again, as carefully as she could. Then she glued his eyes back in with paste and stood back to look at him. Was he all right again? There was something a little staring and cross-eyed about him now. "I'm sorry," Percival, and went off feeling guilty and hoping Aunt Lily wouldn't notice. Meanwhile, Edward had the third treasure of all figured out. There must be a chest of jewels, like a pirate chest, at the bottom of Walden Pond. They wouldn't have to hire a rowboat and explore the bottom with a huge net or a long hook. They would have to hire a rowboat and explore the bottom with a huge net or a long hook. He had heard a rumor that the middle of Walden Pond was bottomless. In that case, perhaps they could hire a diver. Of course, Trebor Nosenibor was the sort of fellow who would go down into the fathomless depths himself. But even Trebor would have to have a diving suit. Perhaps they should find some of the other jewels first, and then use the money from them to invest in the boat and the diving gear. But where were the other jewels? By supper time, Edward and Eleanor were thoroughly discouraged. The game didn't seem so much fun after all. The clues were too hard. Perhaps Ned and Nora had been given a second set of clues to help them. Or perhaps they had just been smarter. After supper, their gloom increased. Aunt Lily had taken on a whole new set of evening piano pupils, and from now on, Edward and Eleanor were going to have to wash the supper dishes all by themselves. They were slow about it the first time. When the last pot was put to soak, Eleanor went to the parlor curtain and peeked through. Timothy Shaw was taking a lesson. Timothy was a member of Aunt Lily's church choir. He had a very good tenor voice, but he really wasn't interested in playing the piano. He had started taking lessons because he was sweet on Aunt Lily. He was fumbling and bumbling badly. Aunt Lily was severe. Timothy was abject. At last he went home, after lingering for a long time in the doorway, and then almost falling down the front steps saying goodbye. Aunt Lily came into the kitchen and leaned wearily against the sink. "Oh, dear," she said. Terrible words rose up from the cellar. Eddie was down there, having a last look around for clues, when Aunt Lily called down the stairs. "What did you say?" Eddie answered in an angry roar. "I said a swear." "That's what I thought," said Aunt Lily. "Whatever is the matter?" "I dropped the toolbox on my toe," bellowed Edward. Aunt Lily dealt with a wounded toe. Eddie was sore. Eleanor was glum. Aunt Lily was pale and tired. "I don't suppose," said Eleanor suddenly, "you'd let us sleep in the tower room." Aunt Lily put her hand to her head and tried to think about it. Why not, after all? The thing had happened there was very long ago. "Well, go ahead," she said. Delighted, Edward and Eleanor decided to go to bed right away. They put on their night clothes hurriedly and climbed the attic stairs and the ladder steps. They jumped into the small beds. Excitedly, they leaned on their elbows and looked out the window. It was thrilling to be up so high, in their own secret place. The streetlights far below shone around the edges of the huge, leafy elm trees. The breeze that had freshened the morning was still playing with their smaller branches, lifting them gently and letting them go again. Away across the Millbrook there were window lights. "You could see Emerson's house from here," said Edward. "His ghost is walking," said Eleanor. "It's just the caretaker," said Edward. Eleanor, drifting off to sleep, found herself thinking of something Uncle Freddy had said when he was talking to Mr. LaRue. "The elm tree thinks the same as me." What did it mean? She had a funny picture of old Ralph Waldo Emerson standing in his front yard, talking on a crank-up telephone that was attached to the trunk of an elm, and the elm tree talking back to him, and nodding its head and agreeing. And into the room the diamond shed its own faceted light, gathered from the street lights, and the starlight in the windows of the Emersons' old house. Softly the light shone over the two children's beds, and over the possessions of Ned and Nora, and over the slumbering faces of Eleanor and Edward. The next chapter is called The Angelic Harp. It has a picture of the moon and the trees. Hope you can see that. The Angelic Harp. They stood at the bottom of an elm tree. It was perfectly enormous. It was easy to see why it looked so big. They were very small. It was delightful to be small. "Come on," said Edward. "Let's climb." Ned and Nora were looking for the treasure too. They were already high up in the branches, far overhead. Eleanor and Edward could hear them laughing and calling to one another. Edward put his foot on a knotted root, sought for handholds in the rigid bark, and started to climb. Eleanor followed him close behind. Hobbled and channeled into grooves, and there were networks of ribs between the grooves. They climbed lightly and quickly, and before long they were high above ground. The voices of Ned and Nora beckoned them on, and now and then, through hollow openings between branches, they caught glimpses of a red head, or a scrap of white dress, or a dangling leg. Up and up they climbed, tirelessly. At last they found themselves at a place where the huge trunk separated, and a tremendous limb split off, like a thumb projecting from a hand. They rested in the hollow for a while, and then climbed on. The main stem rose higher, and then split into long fingering branches. Which way had the lost children gone? Their voices seemed to come from different places, now on this side, now on that. Eleanor didn't care very much whether they found them or not. She was enjoying the climbing itself so much. It was as easy as going upstairs. The shaggy bark offered steps and leaning places, and the outthrust chairs to sit on. She planned to climb to the topmost branch and blow around with the wind. Then, swaying back and forth, she would just let go and fly away. Just fly away and soar and float all the way down to the ground. They were resting again. What was Eddie saying? He was turning his head from side to side. "Listen," he said. "What's that noise?" "What noise?" said Eleanor. She listened. Ned and Nora's voices seemed to have stopped. Eddie lay down full length on the branch and put his ear to the bark. "It's inside," he said. Eleanor lay down too and listened. "So it is," she said. There was a sound inside the tree. There was a murmur rising and falling, like voices talking in another room, and a sense of something flowing, moving, racing. "What are they saying?" said Eleanor. She thought if she could just get her ear a little closer, she would be able to make out the words. Eddie sat up and poked his finger at the bark. If only he had a jackknife, he could carve out a hole in the branch and put his ear to that. Surely then he would be able to surely then he would be able to hear. He knew just the kind of jackknife he wanted. It should have a lot of different blades for doing different kinds of things. Trebor Nosnibor would have a knife like that hanging on his belt, ready for anything, anytime, anywhere. They climbed on again. The overarching crown of the tree was directly above them. The branch they were climbing had tapered down until it was so narrow Edward and Eleanor could wrap their arms and legs around it. The top of the elm tree was like a world in itself, and each of the main branches was like a minor continent supporting a vast population of leaves. The leaves themselves had voices, soft ones. They brushed and stroked against one another, and nodded and bowed, and rippled and rustled, their interleaving gently stirred on by the breeze. It sounded like a whispered conversation. Eleanor and Edward listened, but again the murmuring was too muffled to be heard as words and speech. Perhaps, thought Eddie, it's backwards English. He strained all his attention at tuning the soft leafing phrases around, but it didn't work. The tree spoke another language entirely. Then he heard another sound. It was coming from below them, and they leaned sidewise to find its source. There it was, hanging on a lower branch, a long, narrow box with two holes in the front. It was strung up and down with strings, and across the strings the wind was blowing, making a wonderful strumming noise. They had found the treasure. It was the harp in the poem, and the music that it was made was like a translation of the voices of the tree into some simple and wordless language of the mind. They understood then what the tree was saying, and for a while they sat quietly, just listening to it. But then, without warning, the wind changed. The wind harp tossed back and forth and gave out a strident, shrill sound as gusts blew against its strings. The branch upon which Edward and Eleanor were leaning rocked sickeningly. Edward was flung backward and lost hold with his hands, but his knees were locked and he hung on. The gusts came again, and then again, more and more violently. It's only a dream, thought Eleanor desperately, as the branches lashed up and down. She was one of the unlucky ones who became seasick very easily, and the sensations of wind rising and bottomless dropping were very unpleasant. Could she hang on? She knew somehow that she would not fly away and soar. If she let go, she would drop like a stone. Foolish dream, silly nightmare. Why didn't it hurry and wake up? Why didn't she hurry and wake up? The long boughs of the elm tree were creaking and groaning dangerously against one another. Eleanor despaired, and all at once the wind won. She was knocked off by the down lashing of an upper branch and found herself catching at air and dropping with a frightening speed. Downward she fell, snatching at the leaves. They tore away, but each handful checked her speed a little, and then she caught one that tore apart only slowly, so that she was able to dangle from it, long enough to look frantically around. Then, with a great twist and wrench of her body, she sent herself falling in a different direction. Had she judged correctly? With a scraping, thrashing plunge, she fell against the wind harp and grasped its strings. Secure at last, she hung on, then climbed and squeezed around them, and she wormed her way inside one of the round holes. She was bruised pretty well everywhere, and bleeding from a long scratch on her leg. Nothing serious. She stood up in the bottom of the wind harp and stuck her head outside the hole. Eddie was coming. The wind had died down again, and he was groping his way along the branches that led to her perch. At last he slipped in beside her. She showed him her scratch. Then she woke up. The dream was over. Eleanor sat bolt upright. It was morning. She must tell Eddie about her dream. But Eddie was already up. He was padding across the floor in pajamas that were too big for him. "Oh, Eddie," said Eleanor, "I had the funniest dream. Wait till you hear." She stretched her arms over her head and yawned. Oh, why did she hurt so much? What had she done yesterday that had left her so black and blue? Eddie was jumping up and down. "Hooray!" he said. "I found it! I found the harp! Look, it's right here! The first treasure!" He was holding in his hands the long box that had lain on the shelf of the bookcase. Sure enough, there were the two holes and the set of strings. It was just the same. "It was in the tree," said Eddie. "And the wind blew," said Eleanor, hopping out of bed, "and I fell off." The pain from her bruises and the meaning of what Edward was saying struck her at the same time. Oh, no," she said, bending over. "Oh, Eddie, that was my dream. You can't get into my dream." Edward was staring at her, his brown face blank. "There was a big elm tree," he said slowly. "Yes," said Eleanor, "and you and I were climbing it, looking for the treasure, and Ned and Nora were in the tree." Edward nodded solemnly, and Eleanor looked at him and started to laugh. His red hair was so tousled it was standing up straight, and his rumpled pajama legs trailed behind him on the floor. It was ridiculous. It couldn't be possible. Eleanor sat on her bed and rolled from side to side, laughing. That hurt so much that when she stopped and sat up. But if it was just a dream, why was she black and blue? Then Eleanor lifted the hem of her nightgown and looked at her bare calf. There was a vicious red scratch running from her ankle to her knee. That's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 6. Should be chapter 6. I don't know if you've ever heard an Aeolian harp. That's the type of harp that they're talking about, the box with the streams. It has an unearthly sound. Very interesting. Let me see if I can pull one up real quick. Let's see. Out is different, and I keep on hitting the caps lock instead of the A key. I like the sound of the Aeolian harp. It's full of overtones and just has sort of an interesting sound. Here's a wind harp from the South Coast. All the strings play at once, but only at certain frequencies, depending on the speed of the wind. It resonates better with some frequencies and not others. Hope you can hear that. Strange sound. Well, that's okay. We're strange here. If you want to look it up, turn that off here. Well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's reading session, and hopefully you'll join me again. If you feel like it, subscribe, all that other fun, happy stuff that you are told to do in all videos, right? Because it does help us out. Helps it get recommended to other YouTubers, people who are browsing YouTube as like one of the recommended videos. And so if you enjoyed it, please do those things. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you again soon to find out more about the treasure and the puzzles. Goodbye.